Do you want to start this time, perhaps?
No.
Okay. I might leave that in there, actually. Okay. Well, and it's good to have you back, Andrew.
Thank you very much for having me.
Of course. Last time we talked about total work, which I believe you are inspired by Pieper. In that concept, maybe we can talk about that as well again. And we talked about total work as a phenomenon that's all pervasive in not just the Western world, probably also Asia and other parts of the world. That work is becoming the meaning of existence. It's what people live for. They live for their career, and that we found, just to trace that back a bit, that there is something behind or beyond, or something lurking in or yonder total work, something maybe quite horrific even. And then we also touched on what could be the responses to it and how it gets that far. But before we try and discuss that, I saw a recent blog post by you on the usual reactions you get when you mention total work. So I'll give you the stage, and if you'd like just to summarize those, because I think they're quite telling. And they were very precise also. That there were 5 responses, I think, in total.
Oh man, now I have to remember the 5 responses.
Okay, sorry. Yeah,
I see. I'll aim for 2. 3 will be gravy. Well, last time I described total work as the process by which human beings are transformed into workers and nothing else, as more and more aspects of life are transformed into work. Since I think we'll be talking about contemplation and mysticism today, I might define it somewhat differently. I might define total work as the spirit that makes us believe that we are capital D doers, whose doings are expressed in the forms of working on the world and working on ourselves. Mm-hmm. That's a metaphysical claim. I am the doer. I am the doer behind the deeds.
Yeah.
A Nietzschean line, a line that also goes into Advaita Vedanta. And that doing in the modern world is manifesting itself through manifold forms of work. Yeah. All right, so now we can ask the question on YouTube. What kinds of reactions has this elicited? And so I have a set of reactions. And the reason I'm interested in the reactions is that they hint at something that's trying to touch an existential truth. Yeah. So the first reaction is usually anger or upset. This person is trying to reject this claim.
Yeah.
In fact, just the other day, I was having an introductory call with someone who was a co-founder and who was very successful at this company and who recently left the company. And without even knowing that I have written oodles about total work, he said, I live to work. So that's a very typical articulation. He didn't read Max Weber or Joseph Pieper. He just said, I live to work, and unapologetically and unironically. So someone like that, probably not this person, but someone like that might be prone to react by simply rejecting it out of hand. People have always lived this way. The thought would go, this is what I care about, own most. There is no reason not to care as much as I do about work being the center around which my life turns. And you, sir, are trying to stir the pot.
I disagree, yes. was he quite as polite, or was he a bit...
no, this is not that person. The person's fully polite. I've certainly received a number of impolite responses. And usually there are things like, this dude's a hippie, this guy's what has he been smoking? You know, there's some kind of reference to a counterculture at that point. And I want to say somewhat, amen. So that's the first one. The second common reaction is to somehow downplay the importance of it. So they're willing to grant that there's something to be said about something is amiss about work, but it's mild in nature. So usually someone will talk about work-life balance here. I think I
Yes.
may have mentioned that post that someone
Yeah.
introduces me to a set of entrepreneurs at an entrepreneur club. Oh, this is the work-life balance guy.
Yeah. But you're the
And
total opposite of that.
yeah, I think that work-life balance is, as you might say in England, a bunch of rubbish.
Why?
Because for so many different reasons,
Yeah.
it's a pretty bad metaphysic. That is, I mean, a kind of everyday metaphysic, the view according to which there is something called work, which needs to be balanced by everything else,
Yes.
possibly everything
Yes.
else,
Yeah.
which we're calling life. And that a harmonious life is one in which you balance those two.
Yes.
That's not even going to,
When
that's
you
not
kind
even
of,
a starting point.
yeah, when you kind of think of it, it's actually a horrible phrase.
Mm-hmm.
Because it means work is just something you have to do. It's what is it it's dragging on. How do you describe it last time? And then there's life.
Mm-hmm.
That's the fun part,
Mm-hmm.
exciting side of things. That's where we want to be. Then we have to kind of balance the two. But what often happens or can happen is that we have work, and then what we call life is leisure, free time from work, which is of course industrialized leisure now.
Yes.
So
And however one wants to understand it, it's still the case that you're not even critiquing the secularization of the world. That particular concept presupposes that I'm a secular being who can only ever live for working, be it drudgery or be it meaningfulness,
yeah,
and can only ever work for in industrious free time or for hedonic pleasure.
yes,
So it's taking on board a picture of what it is to be human that I'm disagreeing with root and branch.
yeah.
And then we have people, and I may be skipping one here, so listeners can track my memory by suggesting that there usually are those who try to find loopholes pretty quickly. So they might say, this is a pretty interesting view, and I accept it to a degree, but I'm going to find a loophole. There are any number of things that, and this is really interesting because they want to find some way to value work, metaphorically so. I've spoken with people who say that therapy is a form of inner work, or it's a way of working with my therapist. And that person says, surely that is not what you mean. I mean, well, actually it is. Why are we unwilling to use different metaphors to describe what might be happening in a range of cases? So I rock climb. So people will say, I'm working on a problem. And I was like, no, you're playing. You're doing something else. You're certainly not working on it.
Yeah.
And then, then the fourth one is that someone will be very academic about it and will understand it intellectually, and this will get us around to mysticism, but will completely not accept it with respect to how it applies to that person's actual life. So there's no introspection, right? It's an objective analysis of a state of affairs. It's an objective analysis of the current historical situation we find ourselves in, of the current epoch.
Yeah.
But I exempt myself from any kind of introspective inquiry. And I might say here, out of compassion, that I know this move because I've been an academic, and it's taken me a while over the last 10 years to realize that the best questions are the ones that implicate the questioner in the course of the question. The best questions, the best introspective questions require the questioner to be included in the questioning. The questioner cannot be excluded from the questioning.
Yeah.
And then the last, maybe I've gotten 5 here. And then the last one is some spiritualization of work. Someone is going to take everything I've said, but then is going to talk about a calling in the Western or Protestant sense, in the post-Protestant sense.
Yeah.
Or often we'll talk about the Dharma in some kind of Eastern sense. This is some service that this person is performing on behalf of humanity or on behalf of all sentient beings, and wants to call that work. And I'm still hesitant about that move. My main conclusion is that in its mystical nature, we need to actually go back as thoroughgoingly as possible to see where the last vestiges of total work are within ourselves, within myself, before I'm willing to return and ask, I'm not even sure what the neutral terms are, but I'll put it in the words of the gospel. How can I love other people through my actions?
Yeah.
So I'm using how can I love other people through my actions at this present moment as a very provisional question, because it doesn't yet invoke work of any sort or another, though it might in time look a bit like work, even though the spirit of it is different.
Mm.
So that's the conclusion I'm reaching. It says there's a fundamental critique whose point is to go deeper and deeper to a point at which we have dissolved the ways in which total work manifests in our thoughts, feelings, perceptions, actions, and forms of relating to others.
Yes.
At that point, I'm ready to talk about contributions one wishes to make, or dharma one wishes to live, or ways in which one wishes to help others, or ways in which one wishes to love thy neighbor as thyself.
And that's lost in total work, something like a service to one's community, for example. Because
I speak with people, and they, once I tell them about this, they get around to the step 5.
yeah,
If they're in the more social, entrepreneurial, or social innovative space, and they immediately jump to that one, and they say, "Oh, well, what about politics? Isn't that working on the world? Or what about what about political activism or ecological activism?"
Yeah.
And I just want to say, hang on, this is where philosophy and forms of contemplation are, to use Christian language, ways of purification or ways of purgation. I would like to come back and develop a vocabulary that is genuinely political in nature, polis-oriented, civic-oriented, before we jump into movements that are involved in working on the world in order to change the world in accordance with humankind's whims, desires, and will. That sounds a lot like total work, frankly.
Yeah.
In its particular articulation.
Something you said when you started off now was, you said, I think, we are doers with capital D. That's how we perceive ourselves. I am the doer. Right. I am the one who acts. It's the ego that conflates. First of all, the ego is conflated with the self, and then the ego perceives itself or posits itself as the acting force, as the agent of history. And hence you get to self-optimization in all areas of life, is another weird way of phrasing it anyways, isn't it?
All other areas of life.
Yeah. But then there's this, speaking of Zen Buddhism, for example, there would be rather the perception would be that the activity itself is what I lean into, and I give up myself in that activity. Is that roughly how you would see it as well?
Yeah, there's a lovely passage in Lao Tzu's Daodejing, and I'm going to mistranslate it because according to one translation, there is the use of the word work.
Yeah.
Listeners might not know that the Daodejing is the book of the Tao, the nature or principle or life force of nature, the cosmic force, the creative force, as well as the source of all that is. So it's the book of the Tao and the Day. And the Day refers to human beings' powers or virtues. What's beautiful about the book, and I'm coming to the quote shortly, is that it's trying to suggest that the Taoist sage is the one whose day or virtues or expressions, or I might even say spirit, fundamentally accords with the Tao, with the nature of reality as it flows. So we can come to this passage. In this particular part of the poem, the Taoist sage is said to create without possessing, to be involved in doings without ever taking credit for those doings. And indeed to be involved in doings in such a way that there is no memory of the doings. Right?
Yeah.
We won't even say he does it. There is doing. Now I'm speaking a little bit, and I'd like the language here. There's the doing and the forgetting. The ego remembers because first of all, it comes on stage afterwards and says, "Oh, I did that," right? It sidles up after a non-egoic action. It pops up and takes credit, right?
Yeah,
it wasn't actually there.
Yeah.
If you actually examine it in your own consciousness, you find that there was no egoic activity. There was only the positing after the fact of the ego, which in popping up grabs hold of the action and says, I did this. And then if it didn't go well, it resents it. So it's involved in remembering, right? So
yes, I am I. The I posits itself.
Yes.
So it's philosophically also supported.
Right.
I posits itself.
Right. So I mean, I know you like Heidegger, so I'm hoping that some of this speaks to you. So in Zen, there's also a famous poem, you might say. It's before Enlightenment. Oh man, I'm missing it. This is funny. It's like stack wood, carry water, or chop wood, carry water. There it is. Before Enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After Enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. Okay, it's Zen, but before there is the suffering, egoic suffering involved with chopping wood and carrying water.
Yeah.
After Enlightenment, the ego has dropped. Dogen says mind and body have fallen away.
Yeah.
Which we could talk about. And there's just, usually Zen will use the word just in English, there's just the chopping of wood and just the carrying of water. That's it. That's a full description of the happening, of the happenings. Right? So it's a process metaphysic. Yeah.
Yes. I mean, I would phrase it differently coming from Heidegger, for example, just briefly, because that's not the topic here, but for Heidegger, there's clearing and concealment at once simultaneously. There cannot be any clearing or opening without a self-concealing at the same time. He actually says that self-concealing or concealment is at the heart of any clearing. But the one who thinks is taking part in this event of clearing. So, and this is where it gets a bit trickier. It's when the ego kicks in and the will to power, which is the movement of this epoch, is a strong will to power, which is why Nietzsche is a hyper-modern philosopher. Then the way this closing then happens is in terms of disclosing things as objects of use and abuse and consumption. Further and further. Why? Because you extract power from them by overpowering them, and off it goes. It's circular. Once there's a letting go, the German word is Gelassenheit. The English translation is releasement, which is not really an English word as far as I know. But that's the official Heideggerian lingo here. So it's releasement, or you could almost say being released, letting go. It is then one participates, but in a different way of disclosing the clearing of things. Things stand and things appear as they are in themselves and no longer as things of use of circular replaceability. But we're trapped in the other way of disclosing, where the ego and will to power take over. And we think, and this is then the trick that Heidegger shows us, we think that we are in charge. We are the doers, capital D. But we're, as he calls us, functionaries of technology. We're actually the ones suffering through having to enact the will and the force of techniques, of technology, of, as you know, what it does, right? But we think it's us. So yeah, I would just mention that.
This might bring us around to mysticism here.
Yeah.
And maybe I'll tell an autobiographical story that I believe will dovetail with what you said. I came to mysticism by way of the late French philosopher Pierre Hadot.
Yeah.
Yeah. Who was amazingly good at trying to suggest that we misunderstand the nature of philosophy if we think that it is involved in conceptual analysis or in simply abstract forms of questioning. It is involved in those things, but above all, it's what he calls a way of life. So one of his books is translated into English as Philosophy as a Way of Life.
Yeah.
At the heart of this way of life, he says, are ascesis, or spiritual exercises, whose point and purpose is through their cultivation, through their adoption, to transform one's way of being in the world. He says it's to transform one's perception of the world. Mm-hmm. But I think by perception, he means one's entire way of being in the world.
Yeah.
This really spoke to me in 2009, and has still up to the present, even though I reference him less in my writings, he's still a formative force in my life. But I started to feel, for very personal reasons that we could get into, but may not be important, that around 2014 or 15, that this wasn't going far enough. Something more may need to happen to transform our dualistic understanding that you outlined into a fresh new way of being in the world. So that leads me to some of these Eastern practices and to the idea of enlightenment. It leads me there because modernity is also centered on a certain kind of logos, a certain kind of rationality, or as Adorno would say, instrumental rationality. And discursive reasoning actually can be beautiful if it becomes what the spiritual teacher Francis Lucille calls higher reasoning. Mm-hmm. But it's not sufficient, I've learned. It's not sufficient to bring about a fundamental transformation of our way of being in the world. If it's not, then I wonder what could help. And that's where I came to mysticism. Mm-hmm. And by mysticism, I mean any number of things. Nisargadatta calls it finding out who you really are. And that's it. It could be understood as meditation, properly understood.
Yeah.
I mean, meditation which is not about getting somewhere, but about the fundamental understanding or recognition or disclosing of one's true nature or true home. Or it could be called prayer in the pre-modern Christian sense. That is the prayer of the heart, or the resting into God, or the resting into the divine. Or it could be, could be mystical union, unio mystica, could be the mystical union. Yeah. These are just different handles or different ways of trying to bring into language what I think is non-linguistic. And so what I'm trying to get to somewhat gropingly here, stumblingly, is the proposal that if we're going to, for example, let go of the idea that objects are standing in reserve for us.
Yeah.
How do we do that? I think it's through certain kinds of practices that are supra and super cognitive in nature. And maybe it would help if I give an example. A seated meditation, in a Zen sense, is one such. And we can get into the particulars. It is already bringing one to a much deeper or higher understanding of reality than what seems to be hitherto possible when I just open my eyes and look at the tree as an object standing over there, an inert, mechanistically understood object outside of mystical understanding and outside of aesthetic understanding.
Yeah.
So that's why I care about it. If we're going to move beyond the dispensations of a journey, and its deleterious consequences such as ecocide or technological disruption, then I'm placing my bet on what I'm calling psychotechnologies of transformation. That is, certain exercises, disciplines, practices, and I don't want to make them sound too bootstrapping, effortless, loving, contemplative engagements that in and through their rhythms, in and through their natural rhythms, end up fundamentally shifting my understanding, where understanding is here more than cognitive, though it include the cognitive dimension. Mm-hmm. It's a felt understanding.
What does an exercise like that look like?
Sure. Let's take the Indian tradition. That's probably understood, but let's take a 3-step approach.
Yeah.
The first thing to understand is that if I were to have my eyes open or closed, I would begin to discover that I'm fixated on objects. It's as if I'm seduced by objects. Objects here is understood in a very broad sense. So by objects, I mean thoughts of all sorts, images, memories, anticipations, and so on. So let's call all those thoughts, just for simplicity's sake, feelings, anger, remorse, resentment, frustration, fear, and so on. Sensations, tickles, scratches, flutterings, right? The sensations of the body, and perceptions, broadly understood as touches, tastes, smells, and so forth. Mm-hmm. We've gotten to believe that's our ordinary take in reality. That would be ordinary consciousness.
Yeah.
So some people are fixated. If we're academic in nature, we tend to be more luxuriating in thought, basking in it. You walk around London and you just find yourself bathed in these thoughts, right? There's nothing wrong with thinking. I'm not saying that, but there's an identification that occurs. I am the thinker.
Yeah.
I'm inhabited by the thought. I'm encompassed by it.
I'm a genius.
Yes. But even if you don't think you're a genius, we can still luxuriate. I could be an entrepreneur. I could be thinking about the next project or startup, and I could just be. I'm seduced. It's hard to describe this if one hasn't had any kind of non-ordinary or mystical experiences, because this is our ordinary way of being in the world.
Yeah.
Some people who are more artistic in nature are more seduced by or fixated on or fascinated with perceptions of various kinds. It could be the feeling of a fabric, or it could be the lilt of the sky, or whatever. There are various ways in which we become fascinated. So the first step would be to take an exercise and concentrate on an object. In Zen, there's the concentration on the breath. So when the eyes are closed, that begins to diminish the sense doors. So touch and taste and smell become quieted. And then I would count in 1, count out 2, count in 3, count out 4, all the way to 10. If I lose count, it's not a game. It's not like shoots and ladders. But I do go back to the beginning. So if I lose count, owing to a wandering mind, then I come back to 1. Now, I would call this a concentration or meditation. What is it basically doing is revealing a few things. One, that our mind is unwieldy. It is very wild. I mean, through all sorts of conditioning, it is zipping about from this association to that one, right? So that's the first thing it's doing, is it's revealing to us our mind. And by mind here, I don't mean a container in which these are happening. I mean the minding, I guess is what I'd say. It's revealing minding.
Yeah. but that's the weird thing. So you speak of meditation, and then you go back to the mind, and you say what the mind then actually shows is the polar opposite to what Descartes claimed in his meditations, mind you.
Right.
One of the beginning founding texts of what we now call modernity, which in German means Neuzeit, the new time, the new age, right? Which is telling. It's a new age. There's a dawn of mankind that is taking its course and exploding. And Descartes, in his meditations, claims that all he thinks of is himself.
Right.
Thinking of himself.
Yes,
Thinking of himself. And the exact anyone who honestly closes their eyes.
Right.
Honestly.
Right.
If wants to be sincere to themselves, will have to admit that the mind is ecstatically beyond itself,
right,
going all over the place.
Basically. Yes, that's right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I mean, you can also put it ironically. It's true that all of us, insofar as we're self-centered, do think of ourselves. So there's two ways of playing it. One is, yes, not. He's not really going through a sufficient introspective investigation.
No, but you could almost maybe even say that Descartes, what he's doing, it's a containment strategy, right? There's the idea of the matrix, very present in Descartes. It's almost like a prison, right? And then the one thing to make sure that there actually is an outer world is God.
Sure, I remember that part.
God is dead, so we're all trapped in ourselves. But
the problem of solipsism. So the first part would be if the first step then in this meditation would be absorption in some object. It could be a candle. I mentioned counting. Some traditions use the mantras. Some, such as transcendental meditation, will use a mantra. All these are ways of providing concentration. The Japanese term is joriki, which is a kind of concentrated energy.
Iki.
That's a first joriki. Yeah, don't check my pronunciation. It's probably it's an approximation. So that's the first one. But that's what we've been doing already. It's just giving us a sense of being able to concentrate. So when we philosophize, we're actually doing that. We're concentrating on a single line of philosophical inquiry. So the mind has to be capable of that non-wavering, non-wandering, a quiet, energetic stillness. But that's not even remotely the way ahead. So then it's prepared, I would say, for the second step, which is to see that there's a conscious presence always behind or beneath or around this focus or absorption in objects. There's a ground. So one begins to have hints of that when there is an interval in thought or a cessation of a sensation. When there's a kind of stillness, and one can then begin to get into self-inquiry and ask, what is this? Surely this is not a thought, nor is it a feeling, nor is it a sensation, nor is it a perception. So what is it? And that, over time, if one begins to see that not as a blankness or as an absence, but as a palpable, palpating presence, then that begins, as Ramana Maharshi would say, to lead one to the source. So in mysticism, the source has any number of names. Christian mysticism will call it the Godhead. Advaita will call it awareness or consciousness with a capital C. And so I've had those experiences of going back. It feels like a sinking back, a sinking down, a transporting away. And so what seemed like the absent or almost absent background in time becomes the foreground of experience. So it's hard to put this into words. So that's the second step. The second step is to go home, to go back to the source. And that would be absorption in the source. the Upanishads describes this very nicely when it talks, or Neoplatonism, if you prefer, will describe this as ascent. It actually does feel like an ascent or a certain kind of descent, to use metaphors for basically going nowhere in reality.
Yeah.
So that's the second part. And if one actually begins to non-experientially experience, I'm not sure how else to put that, non-egoically experience,
Yeah.
or be, or dwell, or reside, some will call it abiding. If one abides in that, then that would be called enlightenment.
Yes.
Okay, so enlightenment is just the abiding in consciousness, where that consciousness is no longer limited, scratch out no longer. That consciousness is of its nature not limitable in terms of space, time, or causality. So that's the second step. I'll just mention the third. So the third step, according to this tradition, would be a kind of descent. That is to emerge back into the world of forms, and to allow that the world of forms, thoughts, sensations, perceptions, emotions, and so on, are always rising and falling like waves.
Yeah.
But they're rising and falling out of the ocean. So now it's possible for someone who, in some terms, is called self-realized, to actually see trees and lights and a computer screen and your face, and can hear my voice, and all of them are now understood as arising out of the source, as being made of the source, as being identical with the source.
Yeah.
So that's where this is basically a non-duality. This is a non-dual understanding of reality. And the meditations are meant to not tell you this, they're meant for you to see it for yourself.
So it's, yeah, so not to understand it intellectually and abstractly, but
though I should add that a number of these traditions, the good ones, will make room for intellectual understanding. It is support. I'm in that camp. Some of them are a bit too Zen, and they'll just chuck intellectual understanding. I think that's a deep, grave mistake, because I think we need intellectual understanding. But intellectual understanding becomes cultivated or trained, or humbled. It comes to see that it's in the service of reverence. It's in the service of what I call the heart.
Yeah.
The heart itself, or prajna intuition, or a certain kind of living wisdom, is more fundamental, and therefore intellectual understanding is, I don't want to say serving, but aiding. It is enhancing, aiding that particular deeper knowledge, I guess I'll call it.
Yeah. That is the heart then the source, or is it? Yes. Is that what you would say?
They're one and the same. Yeah. If I may use a metaphor here, it's the faculty of apprehension.
Yeah.
So, but it's also, it is the same as the source. Yeah.
But there was a very interesting verb you used, which was biding and imbibing in.
Yes.
It's one of the least used verbs. You never hear it anymore. It's a beautiful English word, old word too. And there's a tradition in Heidegger scholarship, not a very popular one, which translates Wesen, which is usually translated as essence, in Heidegger as biding. As biding and abiding, and we imbibe as mortals in that. So it's almost a sense of dwelling and waiting. Right. And I think silence plays an important role here as well.
Silence is, I remember some years ago when my wife Alexandra and I went to a Buddhist temple in Southern California, and it was the evening. We walked up this hill, and this was some years ago, so my practice was only so developed at that point. And yet I tasted something. I was up on this hill, and it was cold, and it was It was nearing evening time or nearing sunset, and this is where listeners turn off the YouTube. The secular rationalists have already turned off.
Yeah, they
And
heard.
I could, you might say, my heart
Yeah.
could feel the presence of silence. So silence is misunderstood in modernity as absence. It is neither presence nor absence. It's neither. It's not phenomenal. It's not an appearance or a non-appearance.
It gets rid of the duality again.
Yeah, right. It's a, if one wants to speak deconstructively, is that silence is that out of which appearances and disappearances arise, and it's to which they return. Silence is. It almost brings tears to one's eye because it's that full. It's that.
Yeah, but it's exuberant.
Yes.
It's an excess of itself,
Yes.
which is the exact opposite experience of modernity, because modernity is ultimately predicated on the experience of lack.
Right. Yeah.
We want more. I mean, it's just you have to get very philosophical. Just put it very bluntly: more and more stuff.
Sure.
More and more poverty, weirdly enough, and less. I mean, more and more wealth. Trillions is now a number, right? We'll probably have, I don't know what will be the next after that, quadrillion or something. We'll be quadrillionaires at some point. We'll have gazillions of debt at some point as well. That comes with it, weirdly enough. But the sense of lack of meaning that then has to be numbed with total work, even with a calling, even with we work, right?
Well, they've had a tough time recently, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I know, but they have to. I mean, they're part of this.
Yeah, I was just referring to the troubles with.
Yeah, of course. With the stars.
Yeah, but yeah, exactly. I think we can put this together and say we don't have to get deeply into metaphysics. For Buddhism, the ego is lack. But we can just it is the activity of lack. But we can just go in modernity and say, if modernity is a time of lack.
Well, if only Fichte had known that.
Yeah, it would be a lot easier. If modernity is a time of lack.
Yeah, it's a time of ego.
And if we are a time of the doers,
yeah,
then it's going to follow that whatever it is that we do and think that we're doing will not lead to fulfillment. Yeah. And that's usually a starting point for my philosophical conversations with people, because I've been speaking with the ones who have been, as we know from the last conversation you had, successful.
Yeah.
So something about the total world picture, as Heidegger would say, must be amiss. Yeah. If precisely what it promises is impossible for us to taste. So that's another starting point. I don't need to be attached to the word mysticism. I'm just looking for whatever we want to call as being paths of realizing some of the things that people like Heidegger have said, and others have also said. I can read about them in Charles Taylor or Martin Heidegger or another wonderful thinkers, but I don't yet know it as intimately as I know my wife. Yeah. That's what we need, I think. We need an intimacy of knowing.
And that would come out of the heart for you.
Yes, I that's my proposal. Yes. I mean, it's more than a proposal, it's more like an invitation.
Yeah.
It is a proposal in the terms of logos, but it's an invitation to the heart of another. And by heart, I don't mean the seed of emotions. I don't mean the flowering of our feelings. And I also don't necessarily mean intuition quite in the way people talk about a gut or responding from the gut.
Yeah.
I mean that there is something whole, W-H-O-L-E, about us that is capable of dwelling or abiding in silence, and when it is meet and appropriate and when the other calls upon me to respond lovingly, to respond generously and generatively to that person, and then to return to the silence. But that already implies that the other is not fully other, that there is something more than between us, that there is something that abides within us, right? That I'm not responding to you as that which is other than me. I like the second commandment, love thy neighbor as thyself. I read that mystically. It's not love thy neighbor as if he were my ego. It's love thy neighbor as the abiding reality from which we come. Mm-hmm. Right? Or Buddhists call it Buddha nature. Let me be in love with the Buddha nature that abides in all of us, and let me act when I witness this person, when I'm in the presence of this person. Let me act with that in mind. That's what I call wisdom. Mm-hmm. Wisdom I call as acting as a kind of right conduct, which is flowing directly, immediately, and fully from the deepest possible felt understanding. Mm-hmm. So we're getting around to something that's very different from total work. Total work is an atomized world.
Yes.
With people involved in the belief that they are doers behind the doing, and they're involved in that from the moment they wake up to the time they go to bed. And their days therefore become a resume of of their doings, right? It's a they have a CV of doings that they note and call themselves the doer. It must be clear to us that what we seek that way we cannot find, what we wish for we cannot have. The lack can never be fulfilled. It is a losing proposition. At some point one keeps banging one's head up against the wall, and perhaps that person thereby becomes open to a fundamentally new and different possibility, namely the possibility that that particular picture of who one takes oneself to be and how one takes the world to be are amiss, to say the least. They are awry. And if one takes that genuine possibility, then one is now open to another possibility, to it a very trippy one. The trippy one being that there are hearts. There is a reality from which this arises. Some will call it ultimate reality. That there isn't a fundamental atomistically understood world. That I'm not fated to be subject to the whims of the body and the machinations of volition, my own volition, and therefore that there is the possibility of genuine abiding peace, and I might add of genuine ethical engagement flowing from love. So I care about I care about enlightenment as a way of seeing who and what we really are. I care about wisdom as a way of conducting ourselves based on that deepest felt understanding, and I care about love, or compassion, or whatever you wish to call it, as that from which our actions arise. Mm-hmm. That it is that expression of love that is not understood in a bourgeois sense. I don't keep it in the household, even though I do love my wife. I hope to be able to love all of the people, and I worry that during this conversation on YouTube, this sounds, it sounds a little bit, it sounds a little bit, I don't know, new agey or countercultural or 1960s-ish. I'm not sure what other verb choice to use though. Compassion is a fine word too, but there's something that it is like to act from that particular place. And I think I'll give you an example that'll make it really grainy and almost humdrum. I almost missed our conversation today because we had a flat tire and unexpectedly.
Yeah.
I hope I tell this story right,
Yeah.
because it was really quite astonishing and beautiful. One person starts running toward the car as the car moves, and we realize something funny is going on. So we stop, and the person comes and confirms our suspicion, namely that it is a flat tire.
Yeah.
And he asks whether we need help. And then he points to a mechanic shop, which is just across the way, let's say 20 paces by foot, amazingly so. And he says, you might want to just go over there and get a plug. That is to plug the tire in so that it can be filled with air again.
Yeah.
And then a friend of ours actually comes moments later, and he's someone who is mechanically inclined. My father taught me how to fix a flat tire many years ago. But my friend is helping me out, and very lovingly, in a way that a father would. He's pulling out the jack and assembling it, putting the jack in the right place and jacking up the car. And so we're doing this together, and we're taking off the old tire. And then I'm going over to his mechanic shop, and I'm just asking him about this situation. And I think he's going to say, he starts by saying, well, we've got a lot of vehicles right now. We're totally backed up, so I'm not sure that I can help you. And then I don't know if I just looked how I looked, but he started answering from the heart. I didn't say anything else. I was just asking him. I was speaking in an ordinary way.
Yeah.
It wasn't like olive oil. I wasn't waving my arms up and down saying, help me, help me, help me, Popeye, help me, save me, Popeye, save me. No, it was just an ordinary manner of speaking to this person. And yet, within moments, he said, well, why don't you bring it over here? And I'll plug it, put a plug in it. This is a mechanic. He's not someone who's been schooled in, I don't know, French poetry or something like this. This is not someone who's been studying humane letters. I would say he melted. But I don't say he melted in swooning. He wasn't swooning on a cushion or something. His voice didn't change, but he answered from a different place. And so I ended up taking off the tire. I go back and I take the tire off and I bring it to him. And here we are together. He's showing me how he's looking for the pinprick hole. I'm right there with him as we're doing this together. And then we're finding the pinprick hole. We're testing it. He's doing various things that he's showing me how to do. So he's not just doing it, he's showing me how to do it.
Yeah.
And he's plugging it. And he's taking the part off the plug, and now I'm taking it back. And I said, pardon me, I don't want to miss this part of the story. I said, how much do I owe you? He said, don't worry about it. Happy Thanksgiving, which is like a week or so away here in the United States.
Yeah.
And think about how that must feel, right? So all the kindnesses of strangers and friends have already been shown up. And I think I've told the story. I missed a number of people who stopped by and said, how is it going? And do you need any help? And so on. So I bring it back. I put the tire on and we drive away, and I'm able to have this conversation with you today. But this story, this fairly long-winded story, is meant to illustrate what I'm talking about. That is, people are not going through some sophisticated logical reasoning. That's certainly true. And they're not going through some deep mystical exercises either in the moments before. They're seeing me as the neighbor who needs help. And they don't think, I should help this person. No one else is around. They respond out of love.
Yeah.
So what worries me about the situation is that it appears to be an extraordinary situation that is that which is initiating this act of love. Yes. So that's something we could talk more about today or on some other occasion. But what I'm trying to point out here is that I'm not speaking, when I use the word love or heart or whatever, of something highfalutin and fancy and esoteric. I'm speaking of what human beings are actually like when they enter into a form of consciousness that's available to all of us, usually owing to being triggered by certain situations.
Yeah.
And when we act out of that, act from that love.
Without it becoming a transaction.
No, it's completely a gift.
Yeah.
It's completely a gift. It's not as though he thought, okay, they will write some nice reviews of me on Yelp and Google reviews and elsewhere.
Yeah. Yeah.
He didn't think that, right?
On your Yelp account, yeah.
Right.
Which I might give you after.
Yeah, yes. No, so far as I know, people weren't keeping score. So I disagree with a French philosopher named Jacques Derrida when he thinks that there are no such things as gifts.
He said that.
I think it's the gift of time, if I'm not mistaken. We can quote line and verse, but I think he's skeptical, deconstructively so, of the gift. Maybe I'm wrong about this, since neither of us is fully familiar with it. But what I mean is that I'm at least set him aside, because it's not that important for our purposes. I'm skeptical of people who think that when someone acts out of love or generously, there is somewhere in them or around them but the idea of keeping score and the expectation or wish or hope that there is something coming their way.
Yeah.
I don't think that's true.
Yeah.
In certain cases.
Yeah, no, I would agree. I don't want to add too much. It's just being able to gift goes together with being able to receive a gift,
right?
Which is this almost sheer receiving and then giving, which loses itself in this giving. So it cannot even keep score, because it's a sheer giving. It's not. I'll make a mental note that I helped this hippie, when he had a flat tire.
Right.
When I come around, and remember?
I mean, later on, it might be 2 days from now. 2 days from now, the person might tell the story differently. But
but that wouldn't even occur. That thought wouldn't occur, because it's a sheer giving and a sheer receiving. This
exactly
is what you I think call immediacy or intimacy.
Exactly. As I say, maybe a few weeks from now, he becomes the car mechanic becomes a little cocksure, and he's talking to some friends and they're having drinks, and he says, "Yeah, I helped this hippie guy the other day." But that egoic stance is not what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
So if one is enlightened, as we've said, using the Taoist example and the Zen example, and now my car mechanic example, then there is no attribution of credit to the doer for the egoic doer after the fact.
Yeah.
There's just the magnificence of being and acting from that placeless place of the heart, or of the intuition, or of a kind of wholeness, maybe another way of describing it.
Wholeness, yes. There's like probably 10 different directions we could go now, so I'm not quite sure yet what I'm going to say. Probably happen in about 10 nanoseconds. So one of the things I'm interested in, and this sounds academic, but it's not academic. The reason I read Heidegger is not an academic interest in Heidegger. Heidegger becomes this weird figure of a thinker who's extremely influential, not academically, but who is in touch with Japanese thinkers, with Buddhists, even with monks. And he's also sees that what we now call globalization and cybernetics will want to destroy thinking and those kinds of relationships, but that there's another way of thinking. And this is why what I see with someone like him, but the name doesn't really matter. It's just there is this possibility of having a dialogue between East and West, which is something that you are doing to a certain degree as well.
Right.
One of the things that we can notice, though, in our Western or Westernized post-rational Enlightenment. So by that I mean the European Enlightenment movement.
Sure.
That there is a atomization, alienation, etc., but also an entire lack, or an increasing lack, if you like, of or forgetting of a loving relationship with the dead and with the dying. and with the suffering.
Mm-hmm.
So there is almost no connection anymore.
Mm. I think that brings me to the beautiful writings of the late Ramon Panikar,
Yeah.
who was a Christian theologian, a man who also finished his PhD in chemistry, and who finished another PhD, a third one, in philosophy. This was therefore, we can say, a fairly learned man.
Yes.
And yet it turns out that he was very much motivated by some mystical visions that he had in the 1940s and following.
Yeah.
He's written a number of books. One of them is called The Cosmotheandric Experience, which just rolls off your tongue.
Yeah.
He thinks that the three fundamental or triune aspects or dimensions of reality are anthropos, or man, deus, or the divine, gods, God, and so on, and cosmos,
Mm-hmm.
the nature of reality. I'm going to just zoom ahead to modernity, since that's the focus of our conversation today, or one of the foci of our conversation today.
Yeah.
And I think he describes in ways that Heidegger and others would agree with. He says that the modern world is lived under the condition of humanism. And this means that there's the waning of the divine. He even calls it the divine's abandonment of us, if you want to put it that way. And we know that's true if we have any historical sense. We must know somewhere, be it through history or through literature, or even in our lifetimes, that we're not going to church or synagogue in the ways that we once did. So we can talk more about the loss of the divine, but I just, for the viewers, I just want the person to begin to espy his or her own experience and see how quickly the divine has waned at this particular moment in time.
Yeah.
It begins well before our time, to be sure.
Yes.
By the 19th century, it's already almost a foregone conclusion. But certainly in the 21st century, it ain't nowhere, you might say.
Yeah.
out west here in the United States.
Gotcha.
And likewise, there's been the loss of the cosmos. A number of people have written wonderfully about this.
It's turning into the infinitely expanding universe.
Right.
Which you can call
it's the loss of one French scholar whose name I have a hard time pronouncing. Koyre.
Yep.
Aoyre is one of only people who've talked about the end of the wonderful book, End of the Closed World, or that would be the cosmos, and the beginning of the open universe, or we now might call it the multiverse.
Yes.
Right. So Pascal, whom I've also referenced before, is able to witness this moment. He's shocked and horrified by it, right? Because he's beginning to see that the bosom of nature, the cosmic finite understanding, a place that is a dwelling place or home for human beings, has been shattered by by the new science, mathematization, quantification, mechanization, and de-animization, and so forth, disenchantment, all of these things he's experiencing before it's articulable. And he's seeing the dualistically understood universe, this vast, open, indefinite, empty space. I'm trying to indicate it with my hands very, very, very inaptly. And it's horrifying, right? And we can only begin to understand this when we look out in the night sky many times, and once in a while we might feel intimacy, but often we feel that it's remote from us. Existentialists were the ones who I think totally missed the mark here when they just assumed the cold, indifferent, almost cruel universe. Okay, so So Panakar thinks that in modernity, then humanism begins to reign supreme, or has reigned supreme, and that man is the measure of all things. Therefore, we get trifold development of humanism, what I would call total work, to refer back to my own thoughts, and technology coming together in various ways. Since there is no cosmos, nature can be used as standing reserve, objects of standing reserve to be exploited as humans see fit. And since there is no divine, there is nothing but profanation, nothing but secularization.
Yes.
There's no sense of reverence.
There's no sacrifice. Again,
no sacrifice, no
exuberance.
No
festivity.
ecstatic. Yes, no festivity. That's right. We're referring to Pieper here. No genuine festivity.
Yes.
No holy time or holy days. No sacred. I mean, it's hard for us to understand this because we haven't really tasted much of this. If we go to a festival today, it's a hedonic undertaking. There might be a little bit of a Dionysian splendor, but it's largely about the pleasures of the bodies. It's not about rising beyond the mind body to a larger abiding reality. So that seems to be the context in which we find ourselves. And it's the context in which I keep turning towards something like mysticism, because I think it can do a few things for us in terms of the possibility of a new cosmotheandric vision of reality. So if God has been lost, through certain kinds of exercises or meditations or contemplations, a new possibility presents itself to me.
Yes.
That is that there actually is the taste of the divine. I can taste a conscious presence that is non-human, that is not me, but that welcomes me. So that's one way of beginning to reveal in my own experience the partial overcoming of humanism's enclosure. It encloses itself upon itself. And I think when I have such a way of going home to the divine, it seems to have fled, the disenchanted, profane modern world. When I taste that, I also can, so to speak, go out from there and begin the possibility of disclosing a cosmos. By that I mean, one of the things I'd like to investigate more would be, what would a cosmos, and I don't know the answer to this question, I don't even know how to ask it yet, but what would a cosmos appropriate to our time look like?
Yeah.
One that, so I mean, it's probably going to be much more organically understood or vitalistically understood. Buddhism has some things to say about the interdependence, a process metaphysic according to which all things, beings, and events are interrelated. I don't know what I can say much more about that, but the point is I begin to actually experience cosmically that there is that I am not alone. I'm not atomistically understood.
Yeah.
I cannot be without everything else. I cannot be without the totality of the cosmos. And I don't just think that, though I may think that.
Yeah.
I know it in a way that is as intimate as it could possibly be. So you're starting to get a sense, I think, of my critique of total work. And you're also getting a sense of why I care about something like a cosmotheandric vision, a new synoptic picture of human beings, not vis-a-vis the cosmos and the divine, but woven together, or through a tripartite manifestation of what there is, a tripartite revelation of reality.
Because I read your text on the heart, I just wanted to read one quote from Heidegger from a text which is entitled "What Are Poets For in Desolate Times," which is a quote again from Hölderlin. who, as you know, fell into oblivion and lived in a tower for 20, 25 years. And he was only, I mean, we would probably call him mentally ill or insane or mad these days, but he was only sober when he was able to write poetry. He wrote some of the most touching poetry during that time. And in that text, Heidegger says, at about the same time as Descartes, Pascal discovered the logic of the heart in contrast to the logic of calculating reason. And then he says, only in the invisible innermost of the heart does the human being tend toward that which is to be loved. Ancestors, the dead, childhood, those who are coming.
It's hard to outdo that. It's very beautiful, and that was also what I was trying to, in a fairly grandiose historical way, touch upon. Maybe we can come up with a concrete example here that will put some flesh on what we're saying. We don't know how to die today.
Yes.
And it's
we do not think of ourselves as mortal.
No, but we're also not immortal. It's strange. We don't know how to think of ourselves, but it's as if we will never die. But we also don't think that we're immortal. So we're not Greek gods. It's a pretty perplexing state that we're in.
I never thought of that. That's
it's an unthinking state of neither mortality nor immortality. So it's the state of indefiniteness in a way. Not yet might be a way of putting it. So we don't know how to die, and we certainly don't know how to die well. There are, of course, exceptions to this statement. We don't know how to die. We don't have beautiful rituals that take place in nature or in the home. They often take place in hospitals. And they're not very beautiful. People who are talking now about death in modern culture are saying much more than I can. I'm just speaking from a fairly lofty philosophical point of view, even though it's about a concrete case. So we don't know how to gather around the one who is dying. We don't necessarily know how to share stories. We certainly don't know how to be there during the last moments. We don't usually know how to honor and bless and love. And we don't know how to, and maybe the saddest part is that we don't know how to grieve or even have any sense that we should be grieving. It's back to work, shockingly enough. Something has really gone off the rails. If it's almost impossible for us to, I left out this part when I said we don't know how to die. I also mean we don't know how to, as neighbors, friends, and might I say lovers in the broad sense, care for the one in one's final months and weeks and days. And so all of this bespeaks what Heidegger is talking about. Yes, we don't have ancestors in the way that Confucians did or the way that shamans speak of ancestors. We don't have that. But I'm trying to be very tangible here, just as I was trying to be tangible when I talked about the car mechanic example and the adumbration of love. I mean, the fact that we don't know how to die suggests that we have not yet tasted the inner silence. We don't yet know the fullest, deepest, almost beatific inner chambers of the heart. We don't yet know that non-activity is not necessarily the same thing as boredom, as we spoke about last time.
Yeah.
That there is the possibility that non-activity is where we find peace.
Mm-hmm.
And I know this personally because I won't go into the details. It's quite tragic, but my eldest sister died, and she did not die a beautiful death. Mm-hmm. And I've heard stories from people I conversed with in my philosophy practice about people they knew not dying beautiful deaths. We've forgotten not just how to die well or die beautifully, but we've also forgotten that wonderful line that you know as well as I, namely, to philosophize is to learn how to die. That's from Cicero in reference to Socrates. Yeah. But you don't have to say to philosophize is to learn how to die. It's something like to give oneself fully up to life in its manifold rhythms, to surrender oneself to life as it unfolds, mm-hmm. is to create the conditions of possibility for dying in the fullest possible sense. So all that was to be said about our not dying or dying well. At some point we can go on and ask whether or not human beings die, and that gets us into some pretty big metaphysical differences. Some will say that I am not of the nature to die because I was never born.
Yeah.
So that gets us into some Eastern views. We'd probably see differing opinions.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I don't even want to go there today. I just want to start from our own modern standpoint and try to keep inviting us to see what, from the point of view of humanism, from the point of view of a sort of certain kind of scientific humanism, yeah, or instrumental rational humanism, is of its own accord revealing its own shortcomings. Worse than shortcomings, it's revealing its own insufficiencies, its own inadequacies. Surely we must think to ourselves, just for a moment, a beautiful culture would be one that's capable of festivity and celebration and enjoyment, yeah. And it would also be capable of finding ritualistic ways to face death. One doesn't have to be philosophical. I happen to think that facing death daily is a very good idea, but one doesn't have to be that philosophical.
Yeah,
one can simply think, oh, there is something deeply missing. One YouTube commenter in our last talk said that this is all very depressing.
I saw that.
He said that, yeah. And I thought, yes, that's true, but yeah, it's only partially true.
Yeah, yeah.
What we're saying is it's a diagnosis of something that is sorrowful.
Yeah.
It's an unacknowledged sorrow that we should feel in our hearts.
But we must acknowledge it.
Yes, and there's also the unacknowledged possibility that there is joy.
Yeah. Once
again, that is on the other side of sorrow, or in some respects like a sun illuminating the sorrow.
Yeah.
I've heard people also tell different stories about what it was like to be with their friends and family in a generous, earnest, loving way in their final days and hours. I know those stories too. Those are the rare and wonderful ones.
Yeah.
Those are the ones that hold out this other mystical possibility. The possibility that our hearts can actually sing to one another. Even and especially in conditions where we think they wouldn't. That is the great paradox. We spoke about the paradox last time of boredom, that boredom is actually that through which one may pass to find what is on the other side of total work.
Yeah.
But we shouldn't neglect the possibility that the greatest sorrow, the most painful sorrow, it awakens something in us that's inexpressible And there's one spiritual teacher put it. I was at a retreat recently. He said his father recently died. And he said his father kept repeating, I don't know what I did to deserve all this love.
No.
We needn't get into the kind of quasi-Protestant or quasi-Anglican bit about did and deserve. I think we know what he means, though.
Yeah.
Right. He means that there's so much love, there's a plenitude of love that it is now emanating through him, but is not individuated within him. And it's emanating out of him. We know what he means. Mm-hmm. So we know that modernity, insofar as it is marked by the kind of humanism we've described, is impoverished in its soul, as it were. but we also know that we might have glimpses that surrounding it, like a light of sorts, is the possibility of the love that comes from our hearts in ways that don't, here we're using discourse, but ways that are often not even expressed, not because they're held back, but rather because nothing needs to be said. His father was saying something that he didn't need to say. He was just expressing something out of the bounty of the source. He was saying, there is love. He's saying, frankly, he's saying at bottom, there is only love. And I'm realizing it in the deepest possible sense now. I don't need to say anything. It's emanating through me. But since you're around, dear son, I might as well tell you something. I have no idea what I did to deserve this.
Yeah. That's I believe this uncommented because there's nothing one can add to such a story. I will, however, say something about the comment on how this is depressing. What I noticed when I listened to, actually during our conversation, while of course we were having it, but also when I listened to it again, and we started laughing quite often. And we started laughing at moments where others maybe would think that's not where you start laughing. Mm-hmm. But it's this weird connection that we have. And there's also something that I think just, there's an abyss, there's an absurdity showing itself. Mm. There's something very absurd, something nonsensical that opens up an abyss. And that's usually when I start laughing for no reason. Mm. But maybe that's a way of responding to it too. It's simply laughing it in the face and not taking it all too seriously, or actually maybe taking that abyss then seriously, that absurdity. But laughing in its face and thereby disempowering it. Yes, that's right. Yeah, there are some wonderful posts by a Buddhist writer named David Chapman, posts I read recently about shadows, and that refers to a Jungian concept. Mm-hmm. According to this understanding, a shadow is anything that has been disassociated from me and called not me, mm-hmm. but that actually is in some way inhabiting me in a shadowy way. So I don't know, if I think that I'm just always a nice boy and it's not even possible for me to get angry, then I may find myself getting irritated by angry people I keep bumping into. Yeah. So I don't want to go too far into psychology, but that might be projection. So there's something about me in my experience that has been shuffled onto others, and that I thereby cannot yet recognize in myself or about myself. Well, David Chapman is referring to a writer named Robert Bly, who's talking about how one begins to integrate these shadows mm-hmm. into one's being. And Bly is very keen on playfulness. He says that there would need to be ways of acknowledging and bringing them in, but not in a double-breasted suit sort of way, right?
but rather in a very light and playful way. So it's not the kind of humor that is self-deprecating, nor is it the kind of humor, of course, that is cruel.
Yeah.
Talking about the kind of humor that's akin to wryness, and it's actually in connection with truth. I see something, the abyss, for example, that hitherto I hadn't yet quite seen so fully and clearly. And I can see now, or feel now, in ways that I could not have before. Maybe they were abstract, but not yet vivid, how absurd it is.
Yeah.
And the laughter is a kind of ebullience. I see it, but I'm not destroyed by it.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. That's
So but I'm also not being Woody Allen, or I'm not being a comic.
No.
I'm not turning
Exactly.
away.
It's not.
I'm there with it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's very important, because it's not irony.
Mm-hmm. Right.
It isn't cold, distanced irony or sarcasm or cynicism. That's not what it is, right? And especially it isn't narcissistic or arrogant. We know something no one else knows. Haha, look at us. It's not that at all.
Right.
And we're not trying to be distanced from it, because that's the romantics' response to modernity, by figures like Schlegel and von Kleismer. Schlegel literally says that the only way to live, Julian, one of his characters, one of his books or novels, says that the only way to live now is to be a vegetable, in a vegetative state, right? That's everything else leads to this explosion of intellect. That's I think a misguided response, and that's the ironic response of the romantics. That's the ironic response of someone like Woody Allen, who, why should I do anything? The universe keeps expanding.
Sure.
Right?
Right.
Remember that quote?
Right. Right. Yeah, right.
Yeah. You put it well. I think, which is that's a different way of a different sense of humor, and a different way of laughing. That still perhaps lacks a label or a name. I'm not sure. Maybe there is one, and I'm just not aware of it.
I don't know either. I'll just take a quick stab at it, or a quick stab at an elaboration. So we've said that it's a recognition, or it is an understanding, or a seeing, that I see with great vividness and fullness and directness and immediacy that there is this abyss, or this is the end game of, for example, total work.
Yeah.
I see that now, as I see it as if it were a vision, as if it were a poetic vision. And then something about me lets go or releases in the humor. It provides a certain levity, but the levity doesn't take me away from the vision. It allows me to stay with it in its fullness, without the insight destroying me. I don't become a nihilist. I don't become despondent in the face of it. I don't think that I don't draw the conclusion that it's catastrophic and therefore insurmountable.
Yeah.
So but I'm also not doing the Kantian move by calling it sublime and thinking that the powers of cognition are finally going to outstrip the phenomena that appear to me, right? It used to be incomprehensible, but the mind rises to the point of being able to usurp it in some way. I'm not doing that. No, I'm holding myself in the space of release, and of letting go.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's a moment that Kant would also call the sensus communis. If two people laugh together at this moment, they're seeing something together, understanding something about it and about each other at one and the same time. And that's a kind of friendship, or a kind of communion.
Yeah.
And so I'm riffing right now, as you can tell.
No, but
it seems to me that is the way of saying, I see this, we see this, we do not turn away, we live with it, we may live through it, and we are open to the possibility that around it, unseen, unknown,
yes,
given its seen limitations,
yes,
is something more other and is its overcoming.
and perhaps even salvation. There's this quote by Hölderlin, wo die Gefahr ist, wächst das Rettende auch. Where there is danger, there salvation grows. There is the saving faith.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And Nietzsche,
that's you might just call that, if you will, the genuine religious impulse is the impulse for salvation, the impulse for liberation. I don't mean that necessarily in a Christian sense, but it could be. I'm using that word as it's a salvific impulse.
Mm-hmm.
It's the life. It's the lifeblood. It's the condition of possibility for meaning, in my sense. I think last time I may have called it grace, right?
Yes. Yep.
Salvation is grace. I am now actually open to grace. So the laughter is one moment before surrender.
Yeah, and but it has to come from acknowledging that which is also. It cannot be. You mentioned Jung before in the shadows.
Right.
I posit myself as always happy and never angry.
Sure.
Not into only angry people. If I posit myself as not mortal, I will not be able to die in still demise. Right. In a very sad way. If I posit everything to be perfectly available all the time and entirely deny withdrawal and non-availability, I will always be faced with lack and wanting more. I met a young guy a couple of years ago who worked in tech. He had paid a company to freeze him. He wanted to kill himself. It probably should be sometime next year, if I'm not mistaken, if I remember correctly. When he will be in his mid-30s. He will freeze himself for 200 or 300 years, and then he will come back to life. So you see, by not wanting to die, he's willing to die. Mm-hmm. He's pushing death so far away that he's willing to give up the one existence, the one brief glimpse of a life he has. He will kill himself. I mean, literally, that's just what it will be, in order to defeat death. So by pushing that which we don't desire away, it comes back and hits us, right?
I think you put it beautifully. I like, and it's a really very sad story. I think this is about I think you might also be alluding to a certain movement in the tech scene about, I think it's called immortalism, but the view according to which death can be defeated. Mm-hmm. I might put it that way. Mm-hmm. So the number of people who are really doing research on this, and some of them are just involved in wishful thinking. Mm-hmm. But I'd like to come back to your main point. I like what Whitman says when he says, "I am great, I contain multitudes." Read one way, that would be completely narcissistic. Yeah. But read appropriately, it's mystical. I can contain, I and thou art great. I contain multitudes. That would mean that I contain anger. It would mean that, I think this is where Jordan Peterson made some beautiful points a couple of years ago. Mm-hmm. The social justice left has tended to be motivated by resentment, not in all quarters and all ways. And I think he went overboard with it. But there was something true about what he said. Right? There's a kernel of truth there. So I also contain the possibility and actuality of resentment. Mm-hmm. I contain anger. I contain frustration. Yeah. I contain, in the relative sense, if one is not a Buddhist or a non-dualist, I contain death. I contain fear of death. Mm-hmm. All these things I contain, or within me is the non-doer, within me is non-doing.
Mm-hmm.
All of these are within me. So I can only begin to I can only begin to, in the proper sense which I like to use it, make myself available to the multitude within me if I first am willing to look at them. I mean, look at them. I mean, see. Now we're getting back to meditation.
Mm-hmm.
I see when they arise in my experience. I see when they arise as my experience.
Mm-hmm.
And I neither flee them nor fight with them. Some will call this a more friendly attitude to have. I'm able to welcome them, but with also a wry smile. So I begin to assimilate them, bring them in, but also by so doing transmogrify them. It doesn't mean that we wish to be angry. It means that we wish to see this, that we can no longer think of the other as being a demon bearing no resemblance to us. The mystical insight is that if reality is all one, if it's all one substance, then what arises out of it will be a multiplicity and diversity of forms, names. But it also suggests that there is a kind of filiality between me and the so-called other.
Mm-hmm.
I can't just take that person to be thoughtless, shallow, mean, ornery,
Mm-hmm.
cruel,
Yeah.
bigoted, small-minded, and so on, right? I have to take not just the possibility, but also the actuality that those two are things about myself. Once I do that, though, I don't thereby become mean and bigoted and whatever else.
Yeah.
I become humbled. I like Saint Benedict here, when in his rules for the monastic life, he almost certainly begins with the path of humility. So another way of putting what I said about humanism would be to say that we need a path of humility.
Mm-hmm.
The mind must be humbled to open the heart. The heart is open to multitudes. And it's also open to the silence that is beneath, so to speak, the multitudes. So that's my long answer to the laughter being a particular articulation of the Whitman-esque line, "I am great, I contain multitudes."
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I see that the abyss is the end game of total work, for example, and I also cannot deny that I too live in the abyss, and my life has been shaped by it. My course has been shaped by it.
Yeah.
And you're right. It's also possible that at that very moment, or one moment thereafter, I'm able to denude myself, or disclose myself, or surrender myself, because that's where grace happens.
I think we have to, at some point, think further after the laughter. Because interestingly, you brought up Woody Allen, and I mentioned the Romantics. And there is, because these are different responses to what is going on in modernity.
Right.
So this almost presented itself, because it could also then lead back to, it presented itself, first of all. It showed itself in this conversation, but also there's, it might also then be a response to perhaps the phenomenon of total work and what it is trying to cover over.
Mm-hmm.
Because the other responses could be, let's optimize for leisure, let's optimize for time we have to ourselves, let's get into a good work-life balance, which aren't responses but reactions, which isn't active, leaning into a certain activity, but only sort of leaping from one wheel work into another, for one, as Nietzsche speaks of uncanny wheelworks, right? That's total economic management of the earth. Perhaps there's something in this kind of graceful humor or graceful laughter.
All of those reactions, which are not responses, assume the following: it is too much for me. It is too much for us. Therefore, I'll become an ironist, or therefore, I will become Woody Allen, or therefore I will become a pragmatist, or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to go back to the presupposition that this is too much for me, or let me try to put it better: this is too much for me and for us to bear.
Mm-hmm.
We need to go back to that and actually give ourselves fully up to that to see whether it's true. Is it really true? Is it too much for us? Is the insight, is the genuine disclosing too much for us to bear? I mean, again, this sounds a little abstract, so let's be concrete.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say there's a conversation I have with this woman about the possibility of our philosophizing together, and she said that there were some things that she wasn't sure that you wanted to discuss with me, and I was telling her that when you philosophize, in the way that I philosophize, we go wherever the inquiry takes us.
Yeah.
So it's going to matters of existential weight, and we probably won't know what those are at the outset of any conversation, let alone throughout any number of conversations. So she's more or less asking me, will we have to go there? and I had three replies to her. The first was that I'm fairly gentle in a certain way. I won't press you to go there.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to be involved in force or violence. So that's the first response, which I think should be the case for any genuine relationship, any kind of genuine friendship, any kind of philia in the Greek sense, any caring for another for that person's own sake. But the second thing I said was that it just so happens that if we inquire enough, these things have a tendency, almost of their own accord, to reveal themselves to us.
Mm-hmm.
So there's something there's something about being open to inquiring that can't be reducible to the question, or can't be reducible to the answer, but arrives
Mm-hmm.
between a question and an answer. It over time, it just does. It could be a one conversation, and the matter of existential weight, the very thing that she didn't want to talk about, here it is again.
Mm-hmm.
So I told her that. I said that I will never press you on these matters, but I just want you to know that they have a way of revealing themselves.
Yeah.
And this happens in part because our conversations are untimed. So there is, if it were 10 minutes, it probably wouldn't happen. Think of a meditation. In a meditation, if you just meditate for 20 minutes, most people will be fine with that. Nothing will happen. But if you sit for a full day at a Zen retreat, and it's about 12 or 14 hours of meditating, things have a tendency to arrive. If you want to call them unconscious, that's fine. I'm not really attached to lingo here, but they are some important, matterful things.
Mm-hmm.
And the third thing that I said, and this is to our point, is that the very thing you're running from, the very thing we don't wish to disclose is precisely the path of your salvation. The very thing you don't want to speak about, the very thing that, and by the way, we didn't end up speaking. So the very thing you're turning away from, the very thing that our culture is turning away from, is also the very thing that if we were to genuinely set it before ourselves, that's a different way of putting see it or look at it. So we set it before ourselves, and we come to it with the utmost earnestness, and we come to it in a way of taking our time with it. surrendering ourselves to going as far, far, far into it as we need to go.
Yeah.
Then we may actually taste what it's actually like no longer to be shackled by it. And I've seen this happen time and time again. To inquire deeply enough into the fear of death is not to try to get rid of the fear of death. It is to slowly take the fangs out of the fear of death. It's like taking one fang at a time out of the fear of death. So I think that's an appropriate story. So first of all, we tend to turn away from it. I don't want to talk about this. There are things that I'm fine talking about X, Y, and Z, but not everything.
Yeah.
We know that a proper understanding of reality is that it's holistic. You can't siphon things off in that way. So the second point is that I won't press you on it, but they will arrive.
It will arise, yeah. Because
it will arise.
Because what's at stake is truth.
Yes, that's right. The truth reveals itself. As one of my friends, this is a little bit graphic, but one of my friends says, Peter Limberg says, the truth will bleed out. That's the second point. The third point, though, is when it bleeds out, it's also, I won't say cathartic, I want to say revelatory. I want to say it's actually the very thing that allows us to breathe again. We can finally exhale. Mm-hmm. And that sounds a little bit cliche, but we can finally feel the knots unbinding themselves. I think the metaphor of being shackled is actually a pretty good one. We can actually finally feel that the very thing that we've been running away from has also been that which has been governing our lives, our thoughts, our behaviors, our feelings, our relationships. And there's a certain kind of peace and freedom that are now available to us in ways that hadn't been before.
Yeah, that's the story of the cave.
Yeah, of course. That's the allegory of the cave. Yeah. That is, and it's a beautiful allegory. Yeah. Yes, there are any number of stories that are intending to show that we've been living our lives as if we've been watching shadows in a cave.
Yeah.
And someone taps us on the shoulder and says, "Psst." if you just turn your head around, I know you don't know. I know you don't know you can turn your head around, but trust me for a moment, or give it a whirl. If you just turn your head around, if you, as Plato says, wheel yourself around in body and soul, which is a beautiful metaphor. If you metanoia, if you turn yourself around in body and soul, then something may be revealed to you. But that takes, I guess what I should say about an individual and the collective is that is a moment of trust or faith, or call it what you will, because the person has to turn around, and the person or the collective have to turn around toward the unknown on the presumption, on the feeling that what they're currently experiencing actually is suffering in some way, or lacking in some way, and that turning around will provide them with a vision of fullness. That is a very, I can speak from my own experience while philosophizing with people. That is a pretty tricky move to make. You have to give that person a sense of trust that even though that person is going into he knows or she knows not what, it's worth it. I can't tell you what it's going to be. I'm not a soothsayer, but I have a very good hunch that he'll be better off in the end. Some will say yes.
Yeah. And some won't.
Some won't.
Yeah.
And our conversation is about our culture being able to say yes. Yeah.
But it's and just as a side note, not to derail it too far, but that probably is the significant difference between philosophical praxis or practical philosophy and psychology or psychotherapy.
Yes, go on. Yes.
Because in psychotherapy or psychiatry, what sits in front of you is a case. Is not everything matters. What matters is that one issue, that one problem that someone has. So and that can be treated. So it doesn't need to involve everything. It can actually abstract from certain aspects.
Yeah, there are some things that psychology and psychotherapy are quite good at, and we could go into those things. But I think Pieper put it quite well when he said that philosophy invokes God and the world.
Yeah.
Every philosophical question invokes God and the world. I think he's right. I mean, every philosophical question invokes the source, that from which the source arises, the totality or a cosmos of sorts, and our place within all of this. Every genuine, I'll just modify it by saying every genuine philosophical question is therefore, in the proper sense, holistic. So philosophy of this kind, the kind we're speaking about, is extraordinarily beautiful and exciting, as well as extraordinarily demanding.
Yes.
You're asking someone to take a pretty profound risk, right? But the risk is, it's a good wager, I would say. You're taking the risk that there is salvation.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. I like that idea. Maybe we, but there's maybe something to that too, that in modernity we don't want to be saved. There's also something to
we don't believe that we need to be saved. I think that's the way I put it. We don't believe that we need to be saved. We think that we can carry on indefinitely with business as usual.
Yeah. Indefinitely, which is not infinitely.
No.
Which is it sounds almost the same. And I think it's probably taken on.
We can kick the can down the road for as long as it's possible.
Yeah. Kick the can do on the bucket list, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, it is a weird state of a very benign and so on and so further.
Mm-hmm.
Without any limitation, without anything that is allowed to matter. And
yes.
Yeah.
Yes, that's right. And therefore, we can keep being the ones who keep on keeping on. Yes, we can keep being the ones who are doing what it is that we're doing indefinitely.
Yeah.
Without yet.
But that's the logic of total work.
Hey, I'm with you. It's true. Yeah, we can keep on keeping on, right? Whereas one conversation partner insightfully said that what I am after in some respects is soulfulness or soul. That's not everything I'm after, but I'm after. But to speak of soul here in a metaphorical sense is to say that we're capable of depths. And those depths come from, I think, giving ourselves fully up to suffering, as we spoke about last time as well. Giving ourselves fully up to the sense that the suffering matters to us. It's not benign.
Yeah.
It is something that's ungainsayable and prima facie ineradicable. it niggles us. I won't say it haunts us. That's a common metaphor, but it does kind of, it grates. I think that's a good metaphor. It kind of grates at us once we start to pay attention. And so we start to struggle with it. And in modernity, there's um, as one philosopher puts it, whose name I can't recall, it's a Korean man who lives in Germany. There's an aesthetic of the smooth. Sorry?
Jung-Chul Han.
Yes, beautifully. Yes, that's right. He has one book that's about aesthetics, the aesthetic of the smooth. We're not Taoists, but we want everything to be kind of aesthetically smooth, easygoing, all right? Kind of
Rounded.
right. Heiga in Danish. It's kind of cozy too.
Yeah.
Heiga.
Like this.
Yes, it's like that. It's all very.
You stroke it and everything. Yeah.
Yes, it's frictionless. It's bumpless, in a way. Hiccupless. So, but that's
existence.
Yes. I'll let you have that as the first book. But that's not actually in keeping with reality. Reality hurts. It stings. It bites. I like Johnny Cash a lot. He's someone who's a writer of the stinging and the biting and the gnawing and the niggling. So we have the suffering, we have the struggle, and the third thing we have is that we actually, through a kind of very thoughtful engagement with the suffering and the struggle, are capable of coming to a kind of roundedness, as Ian Forster might say, becoming a round character. But I mean more than that, a soulfulness, a depth. So that's also, I'm trying to capture also a certain spirit of the modern person, who's going along, keep kicking the can along indefinitely, wanting to believe in a Californian sense that the worst thing that can happen is that things can be a real bummer once in a while, right? A little bit of a bummer. Yeah, it's a little bit of a bummer. I lived there. Yeah. But otherwise, there are no genuine rifts, shocks, ruptures, tumults, and I'm not speaking here about neuroses either, because in New York it has a certain darkness, but some darkness of neurosis. I'm talking about someone who's starting to get that life has this taint. Life as we ordinarily experience it has a taint of suffering.
Yeah. Becomes neurotic there.
Yeah, but there's something is a little bit turned or off. You start to notice that, and that's the beginning of all that we're talking about. The varnish. You start to notice the varnish isn't as, I'm speaking metaphorically, of course, but the varnish isn't as good as you thought it was. Things aren't actually as polished as you think they are. These are all starting points for beginning to see that you can't keep kicking the can down the road indefinitely. Life has recoil. I like to call it kickback, right? At some points they kick back.
Yep.
I know an older woman right now who's been avoiding death. She's not someone I philosophize with. She's someone I know through other people.
Yeah.
And recently her cat died, and her cat was very dear to her. And more recently, her sister died, and her sister's husband died. And this is all in a fairly short period of time. And this is what I mean by kickback, recoil. The very thing that she's feared, as her life has been going along in this very smooth, seemingly smooth and friction-free way, is precisely what's getting very close to knocking her in the face. I mean, she's trying not to be knocked in the face by it, right? But that is just...
It's kicking her harder.
Yes, that's right.
It's coming back to kick her even harder.
Yeah.
Kick her in the face, you're going to kick her in the back.
That there's a joke here, and the joke is that the more you kick the can down the street, the more you're apt to be kicked in return, right? Kicked in the butt.
Yeah.
So there, in the end, or as people would say in philosophy, in the final analysis, there is no friction-free exit from the weight the weight,
Yeah.
the gravitas of life.
But this is so the fact that you mentioned exit now that this comes up is interesting because exit is, you know, you might be very aware of this given that you are close to the tech scene and how many people you speak to. Is exit or exit strategies are very important to people who are trapped in total work and see it as their fulfillment one way or another, as a fulfillment that kills them or as a fulfillment that actually they deem to be their calling. But there's talk of an exit, exiting institutions. The line of flight with Deleuze, or this kind of aesthetic leaving something behind. But that sometimes sounds to me, and this is pure, you know, this is not philosophical, this is just an observation. It sounds frictionless. It sounds like wanting to just, where is the door? Give me the golden gate, and I'll step right through it, and I'll be free from all these shackles. But all I have to do is find this one exit, and I'm out of it. But it neglects, perhaps a bit, the necessity of suffering, and that if you want to exit, it's a friction. There'll be bumps in the road. There's more suffering, less security, if you like. All of the niceties of bourgeois existence will be gone, right? If
what you've done is you've courted, flirted with, and been ultimately seduced by a delusion. The delusion is that if your circumstances change, life will henceforth completely go in your favor. Now, some things are true about that. If you have more wealth, some things will be much easier for you. If you have more wealth, certain forms of happiness will be more readily available to you. But that's not quite what we're talking about here. We're talking about the fact that ultimate happiness or fulfillment or peace, in a number of the Eastern traditions as well as Stoicism say this, cannot be contingent or dependent upon external circumstances or the wind blowing in your way, the wind blowing favorably. The reason is that it's delusional. It's narcissistic. It's monomaniacal. You think that the world can now be created in your own image, that it will bend to your desires, whims, will, and ideas.
Yeah.
But that's what I mean by, I'm using this metaphor now very spiritedly, by kickback. There's a point at which that whole delusion is pierced. So yes, exiting could, if the IPO goes well, bring the founder considerable wealth.
Yeah.
And it may make it possible for that person no longer to need to work again. But the Buddha knew that this is not the basis for happiness. So that is not going to dissolve the fact that your health could go south. So I'll give you one Buddhist prayer or recitation. It's called the 5 Remembrances. I'll just give you the first 3. The first one is, I am of the nature to grow old. There's no way to escape growing old. So that's contrary to what the immortalist camp says.
Yeah.
I am of the nature to have ill health. There's no way to escape having ill health. To be sure, some people do die of what we call natural causes. But by and large, we're not going to escape having ill health now and again. And the third one is, I'm of the nature to die. There's no way to escape death. So long as we don't believe in anything about what Buddhists call going beyond birth and death, these become more than facts. They become clues for us. They become clues because they point to the fact that these forms of suffering appear at first blush to be ineradicable, inextirpable. They cannot be uprooted by changing your wealth. So I speak with people who do tend to be, not all of them, I speak with artists as well, but they do tend to be on the fairly wealthy side.
Yeah.
But lo and behold, some of them have ill health.
Yeah.
And that was the condition of possibility for philosophizing. How could, That's a bit like theodicy. How is it possible for a good person to suffer? It becomes somewhat perplexing. How in the modern world that's friction-free am I the one? How could it be that I am?
Yeah.
And I don't mean this person is not.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm a genius. What?
Yeah. So when I say that it's delusional to believe that exiting from a startup means entering into a suffering-free, completely happy life,
Yeah.
a life where everything is now abundantly yours, I mean, it's an extraordinary mistake that's going to have kickback effects later on. Your loved ones will die.
Yeah.
And that's another part of the five remembrances. Your health may flag for reasons you know not. Your wealth may depreciate, or you may just be fearful that it may be enough to say that you're fearful that it'll depreciate. If you're living in Argentina, your wealth is depreciating. I speak with a man in Argentina, and it's the case that their economic situation there is very precarious.
Yeah.
Or in Chile, you may just be born in a situation where the economic and political situation is not amenable to you're doing well financially, or for most people doing well financially. That is just fact. And so once again, you think that you have come to the promised land, but you've actually come to a more sophisticated, this is the point, to a more sophisticated form of imprisonment. I'm not saying you didn't escape the small prison. You did. You escaped the prison of penury. Right? You're not going to be poor. You're not going to starve to death.
Yeah.
You've escaped the prison of having to be gainfully employed. And as someone who doesn't really believe in a ubiquitous system of gainful employment, I do say kudos on that score. However, you haven't escaped. All that's happened is you've made a more sophisticated, quasi-ethereal form of imprisonment for yourself.
Mm-hmm.
That's where I think I'm using life here in a somewhat agental sense. I'm not sure how else to use it. It's that life has a way of it just shows you something that's, if you haven't, this is very Taoist in spirit, if you keep living your life as if what I just described, that larger prison, is actually a proper understanding of reality, then it just knocks you. It discloses your delusions. I'm using delusions here in a Buddhist sense. That is an inaccurate understanding of reality.
Yeah.
And since we're talking about modernity a lot here, we might just say that modernity is continuing to present us with opportunities that are disclosing kickbacks. So we don't have to call it a mental health crisis necessarily. We can call it modernity saying hello in the ways of kickback. Right?
The horror shows itself.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. Like, wow, I feel alone. Interesting. Or wow, no one. It's atomized. There's no one here. If I call someone up at 2 a.m., no one will pick up.
Yeah.
Wow, there's no meaning in my life, and I don't know what meaning would be except for some neologism about total work. Oh, wow, I can keep going on here, but wow, the what I thought was going to be an enriching life when I was younger is turning out to be impoverished or bankrupt in ways that I can't yet articulate.
Yeah.
And the only thing that's sad is the person thinks it's initially about him or her. And this is where I think that history and philosophy and sociology are really quite illuminating here. It's like, no, it's not you. It's all of us, man. Don't make it about you. It's partly about you, but we're all in the same soup.
Yeah. It's that's probably the most difficult thing to get across, is that it is about you, but not in the way you think it is.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So it is all about you and I.
Yes.
but not how we are prone to believe in this epoch that we live in.
Yeah, that's right.
It is about the self,
Yes.
but not about the egotistical, narcissistic ego that wills for its own survival and I don't know, status gains, etc. But it is about lapsing back into the self, what do you call the heart, etc. It is about that. And then you find yourself, but not in this way that the entire self-help industry is trying to tell us that we find ourselves.
No.
It's I can't put it any better, but do you roughly
yeah, I think that there are two ways of understanding what we're talking about here. One is to put it by saying that these are wrong-headed ways of knowing thyself. And I think that knowing thyself is one of the most fundamental pursuits. It's one of the most important introspective questions we can ask. What is it to know thyself? And we need to ask what knowing there means. We need to know what thyself means. So we can say these are wrong-headed approaches, but I would also like to sound, I think, a very charitable note and say they're wrong-headed approaches that can put someone on the path to genuine self-knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
And that self can be a little S self or big S self, depending on which view we're espousing here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean to say that I've spoken with any number of people over the years, and they begin somewhere. That is, they might begin with self-help because that is in their purview.
Yeah.
But there's no reason why that can't be the starting point. I mean, some of these, if you just take a self-help book that's geared towards success, at some point you might think this is very effective at helping me be successful, but what is success?
Yeah.
Okay, well, it doesn't really tell me what that is, but it presupposes that it has something to do with financial success and with merits or social recognition. Are those the things that I really want? I'm not sure. Then what is it that I really want? And so you've taken a book that is very good at helping you become successful, or maybe you've had a coach who's been helpful at making you successful, but you might have doubts about these things. Mm-hmm. And so the very place you began becomes not the end point, but the starting point for the deeper investigation into what it is to know thyself. Given that philosophy itself has abdicated its responsibility in the modern world to be there with and for other people, far be it from me to begin by knocking what is to some degree there for people, such as self-help or coaching books. They are quasi, in some cases, quasi-philosophical treatises. Therefore, in the vacuum,
they answer
in the vacuum, bodying forth the modernity.
Yeah,
something is speaking into it. So I have a kind of minority view, which is that when philosophy and theology, yes, in part through the movement of humanism and modernity, but partially also through their own fleeing of the scene, through a certain kind of existential cowardice, I may put it so boldly. Because of these developments, people who begin the search will go to what is in their purview.
Total agreement. I mean, the philosophy, when the philosopher leaves the polis, right, then the sophists take the stage, and this is to the responsibility of philosophers to come back to the polis and to the market square, and play with it, and but stay
and not in a high-minded way. They have to begin to play in it and with it in a way that we might say is also quite playful.
Yeah.
That is because one has to begin with where the one is and where the people are. Therefore, one needs to do one's best to speak the language of a people, and to be with those people, to be convivial, as Ivan Illich would say, with people. But then one has to be, or is invited to be, a little wryly, or almost devilishly, quote unquote, playful.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm doing with regard to total work. I'm starting with people are. So you want to talk a lot about work. Okay, well, let's see where this takes us.
Yeah, we see where that takes us. Yeah. How did I end up here? I wanted to talk to you about total work, Andrew. I don't know what happened.
Well, let's see where this goes. Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think a similar line of inquiry could begin with technology, since that is a profound force in modernity. But one has to, as it were, get off of one's horse, come back. You put it beautifully, get off of one's horse. I know we're speaking here about academic philosophers to a point, but I don't really care who it is. That is, in the past, I used to think, academic philosophers need to get off their horse and come back to the polis. But now I think some should and will. I also think, however, that other people who are philosophically inclined or have a philosophical spirit need to come back to the polis as well. So we don't need the honorific of philosopher. We just need those who are, as I would put it, contemplating ultimate questions, or those who are devoted to the loving pursuit of a wise life on their own and in common with others, to begin the inquiry with other people. And at that stage, then, as I say, it's about not presuming that one is wise, but rather being open to starting from where we are. It happens to be total work at this point.
Yeah.
You can't say, and then moving somewhere else together. And when I say beginning from where we are, I also mean, for example, that work seems like the most banal starting point.
Everyone can agree on it.
But I mean, when I say banal, I mean, it seems to me the most seemingly unphilosophical place to begin.
Yeah.
Right? It's a bit like beginning with going to the bathroom or something like that. It's banal, and people need to do it, it seems. Why would you begin there? Let's begin with epistemology or metaphysics or ontology or metaethics or whatever. No, you begin with what's actually happening in people's lives.
Yeah, it begins with the everyday.
Yes.
As Heidegger says in Being in Time, and he actually says that Aristotle's book on rhetorics is an analysis of everyday life. It's not a toolkit on how to hold a nice and good speech that convinces people. Mm-hmm. It analyzes how we are with each other. That's being with others. It's I think also because what you just said could also be leading to something that we touched on it, that this is an epoch of a lack of, or where we have the sensation of a lack of meaning. But also that bringing philosophy back to the polis, or those who are philosophically inclined, those who are seeking truth, or seeking to speak truth, insofar as this is possible for mortal finite beings. That this is, if you like, an announcement of a return of meaning. And that this is also a very different epoch and era that's beginning, weirdly enough, thanks to technology. There's a way of having this discussion that wouldn't have been possible, quite obviously, 10, 20 years ago. And we wouldn't have met in this way. And it brings certain things to the fore that are covered over in, say, the second half of corporate 20th century, where that kind of discourse was completely prohibited, right? where any kind of self-help would only probably mostly be about success,
Sure.
at least in the the mainstream. But now there is no mainstream. Now there are these obscure YouTube channels like mine
Right.
that
Right.
that have about 5 subscribers, but you can break into dimensions that aren't open, and this is complete. There's no time limit.
Right.
There's no director. There's no one sitting behind me saying, "Look, by the way, it's time to go now."
Right.
It is completely open, and people can take this with them, and they might listen to it for 20 minutes, and again another 20 minutes or so. But there's something that's occurring to me now, is that we should give up on the 20th century. We should completely give up on that. It's been one big failure, almost all of it. Sorry, and
It's okay. I'm okay with that statement.
and realize that there are new possibilities really on the horizon. I know this sounds maybe a bit like a cliche, but we need to be, as Nietzsche says, active talents, not reacting or complaining, but building towards that new, call it a golden age, or a new age that is exuberant and flowing, gifting meaning, access of itself. And if it's not there yet, and I don't get to see it, I'd rather have built towards it.
Right.
Having just been sitting here complaining about the news and the weather and the food and
sure.
where's my bumperless existence, right?
Right.
Whatever it was before you.
Right. I think you're right. I think you're onto something. I think there are any number of, so we can talk about technology in terms of the harmful consequences brought about by any number of forces, most recently social media, or certain ways in which social media have been optimized for attention grabbing.
Yeah.
But what is beautiful about what might be called appropriate technology is that it can be repurposed.
Yes.
Right? It's repurposed in ways that were unforeseeable.
Yeah.
I can use Skype or Zoom in such a way, or I close my eyes, the other person closes his or her eyes, to take but one example. So I'm using it somewhat in a way that was unforeseen there, and it's creating the space for a conversation that is timeless. And you're pointing to this forum, and I could point to a number of other examples.
And and the technology disappears.
Yes,
right? That realm that wants to be exclusive and all powerful and all pervasive in such conversations as you have, for example, on a daily basis, as we're not having, for example, it disappears. It's just a simple instrument. It's not anymore what it's about, right? It's not. Yeah.
Yeah, it becomes. What's the adjective here? But I guess we could say a humane use of technology.
Yeah, that's good.
It drops off. It dissolves in in what it makes possible.
Yeah, it opens a humane ethical dimension.
That's right.
Next to the epistemic technical, which wants to be exclusive.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I can only second your thoughts, because let me just make it personal once again. Yeah. I know that almost everyone I've met, and this is not an overstatement, over the last 10 years, everyone I've met who seems, and so far as I can tell, is humane, earnest, non-ironic, truth-oriented, and so forth, I have met through these humane, ethical uses of technology.
Yeah.
I haven't been meeting them. And I'm not saying that the people around me are terrible. I just haven't. I've been meeting what I like to call fellow weirdos,
Yeah.
right? And I
Yeah.
mean that, and I mean that I include myself in that description.
Yeah.
And through this, websites, blog posts, um, to some degree Twitter, rarely, but occasionally LinkedIn. You know, I mean, these are things that are being used against the grain or are happening in the margins. And I think we're getting closer to what one of my friends, Peter Limberg, is calling we spaces. That is, ways in which people who are not living in or near one another, not necessarily, are convening for the purpose of coming to higher states of consciousness or awareness together. The technology such as Zoom or Cisco WebEx or whatever is making possible potentially lots of people being quote unquote on the same call, but the call itself is dissolving into the background, and in the foreground is emerging the I thou plural, right? Which is really quite remarkable. It's an actual demonstration of, for example, post-animism, or it's an actual demonstration or feeling of meaning. And I think meaning is grace. That's the way I would define meaning. I would say meaning is that which, going beyond the finite bounds of the ego, puts one deeply in touch with a greater abiding reality. And that can happen through conversations like this. There is what I say, there is how you're nodding, there are the things that we say, the questions we raise, but what may happen or emerge in the conversation is not identical to what either of us says, and then therefore might be considered an imminent form of transcendence. Mm-hmm. Or it's not what we put into words, nor do we desire to do so, but it is what animates. It is the spirit of the conversation. It's what gives it such life, such vibrancy.
Yeah, esprit.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, that's right.
Conversation.
Yeah.
And that's a wonderful art, mm-hmm. Right? Where we're also this could be egotistical. Mm-hmm. This could be what I claim.
Sure. Yeah.
Well, no, thank you very much for an interesting comment, Andrew. But I would argue that.
Right.
And we could do this for 2 hours, and it would be an interesting bullfight or cockfight or something. But it wouldn't lead to anything. It would have a very different esprit.
Right.
There would be no joy flowing from it.
Right. That's right. I'm taking your point about
it's 10:30 here. I'm not tired. I was tired before this conversation. I'm not tired anymore.
Yeah.
That comes with this esprit. 10:30 at night, by the way, just.
Yes. That's right. That's exactly right. And so we're trying to allude to what could be various forms or manifestations or demonstrations or experiments, as people are calling them nowadays.
Yeah.
In convivial, humane convenings, which are oriented toward any number of things, but in my language, matters of ultimate concern. Well, it's the language of Paul Tillich, but I like to utilize it. And in all these cases, we're also experiencing, or we might be experiencing, spirits, a spirit mm-hmm. that is suffusing the atmosphere with something that is undeniably here and now, but is also undeniably not mine, yours, hers, or his. So that would be it's a flowing of meaning, or at least as I've been using the word today, often a taste, or as one spiritual teacher calls it, a kind of perfume of meaning. Nothing that anyone can take credit for, just actually taking in the scent or the perfume of meaning.